roto I te wenua te upoko te ika maui tiki tiki ataranga he. Ai ria tuka tai ki te puta I tangare ua. Ki te kaui wetua matariki e. Ka uri taku aro ki tūraki rai piki atu ki tā poko ki pāpata I ki orongorongo. Ka rere te kaui maunga ki puka atua ki te wakapu are te wa o te ika. Ia umai I te waimanga I rua tūpua I rua tā uito. Ka putako te ara tūpua ara nuku tūpua ara rangi. Rere atiki utaki rumutaka ki tararua e kei o ki parero ki pōkai mangu. Wakawiti atu ki pepinui a te titiro ki te rimurapa ki tō tika atu ki tūraki rai. Ko te mananui o te papai ora nei, he titi anei takuro kurei te wenua. Ko Te Āti Awa no runga I te rangi taranaki wānui āruru ki te papa e tau nei
Tākina te au ka riri, tākina te au ka ngua, tākina ngā au o te tonga, tākina ngā hau o te wanganui I atara. Nā tai eke ngā o tāwiri mātea tākina I arango te wenua. Ko rongo ki te waka tūpua, ko rongo ki te waka tāwito, e rū I te one I uta, e rū I te one I tai, e rū I arangi nui e tūnei, e rū I a papatu anuku e takoto nei, e rū I a tangaroa. Pū e ute one pākini te one ko te one itua, kamakawarua, karanga tūpua, karanga tāwito ki tōna waka māroro au. He toka haumi I aro a, he toka haumi I rongo mau, kia mākoha I te hauriri, kia mākoha I te haunguha, heke iho I te rangi ka tutu a niwa, ngā au oro kiwa o I te hau pāmaiwa o, ngā auriri ki te au mārino o te wanganui I atara. I te au, I te pō, I te au, I te pō, hau a whio, hau mā taka, hau, no te awa o te ora, hau, ki te wanganui I atara e hai. E rongo matāne, whakairihia ke kirunga, turu o whiti whakamaua kia teina, hui e, taiki e. Ai, timata tātou I wainga nui tērā urutapu nui tango ngā tua Māori tūturu. A rā korangi nui e tū nei ko papatu anuku e takoto nei, koe nei tō tātou tai ao, te ao huri nei e noho nei ai tātou, ko mātou, ko koutou, ko tātou ngā kaitia ki moe nei taongana nui. No reira koe nei te hononga I wainga nui a tātou I tēnei ata papai. No reira, e ngā kaitiaki mai tērā roe, mai tērā wānau, mai tērā kainga, mai tērā hawaiki, haramai. Haramai I roto I tō tātou whare piringa e tutu mai nei a rā ko tākina. Tākina atu rā ngā kōrero nā wānanga, nā whaiwhakaro pai, hei aha ai, hei whakatinana te koeoratanga, te hauoratanga, te waiora tonutanga o tō tātou tai ao e hora nei. No reira e te iwi taino atu te mihi, ki te hunga e arohaina e tātou, nā rātou e haere ki te papa o Tangaroa hine moana ki te rāwhare tūpuna o rarohenga. No reira e ngā tini mate, kei wainga nui a tātou katoa e hora nei, ka mihia, ka tangihia, ka poroporo aketia. E maumaharana tia kia rātou, te hunga e arohaina e tātou, mo ake tonu rā, I roto o tātou puna mahara, o tātou moana hine ngaro. Hoki mai anō ki tērā kainga tūturu o tātou te tangata. A piti hono tātai hono rātou te hunga mate ki a rātou, a piti hono tātai hono tātou te hunga ora ki a tātou. Ai, e hoki ana te kōrero o te whenua whakapapa nei, tēnei ka mihi, mai tērā tohu o te kahu o te raukura, o tō māu e iwi nei o te Āti Awa taranaki whānui, haramai. Pērā hoki ki te ingoa o taua marae kei waiwhetū, a rā ko aroha nui ki te tangata, ka toa atu māua, tēnei momo ahuatanga pai kia koutou e kawea mai nei. No reira nā i runga e rā whakaaro pai, tēnā koutou, kia ora tātou katoa.
Tākina te au kariri, tākina te au karua, tākina nā au o te tonga, tākina nā au o te wanganui atara, nā tai eke ngā o tāwiri mā te a tākina i a rango te wenua. Korongo ki te waka tupua, korongo ki te waka tawi tō eru, i te one i uta eru, i te one i tae eru, i a ranginui e tūnei eru, i a papa e takoto nei eru, i a tangaroa pue u te one pakini, te one ko te one i tua kamaka warua, karanga tupua, karanga tawito ki tōna waka, maroro e toka, he toka haumi i aroha, he toka haumi i rongama, ki a mako ai ta hauriri, ki a mako ai ta haungu a heke kei o, i te rangi ka tutu, a niwa niwa ngā oro, ki waho i te haupa maiwa o nanga, auriri ki te au marino o te wanganui atara, i te au i te pō, i te au i te pō, hau, hau, haua pia pio, hau, hau, hau mā takataka, hau, hau, no te awa o te ora, hau, hau, ki te wanganui atara, hei! Turuturu o piti whakamaua kia teina, hui e, tai e.
Oh, that'll wake you up in the morning, whānau. Kia ora, Auntie, mihi atu kia koutou. Good morning, everyone. If you're wondering who we are, I'm Nathan, this is my auntie, Auntie Ellie, and we're very humbled to come on behalf of the local iwi here, Te Āti Awa Taranaki Whānui, to open your conference here today. You know, our elders at Waiwhetu Marae tell us that when it comes to a whakatau, it is about connection and creating a space and place where all ideas and thoughts can be brought together in a comfortable state. And so we thought we'd just give a very brief explanation of what just took place there. As I said, it's a whakatau, and Auntie started off with her beautiful karanga. It is the mana of ngā mano ngā wahine, the power of our ladies that can open a place and space. So it's rightfully right for Auntie to open up with her beautiful voice. I'm trying to get brownie points so she might, hook me up later on. So Auntie was calling out to you, the people, the guests who have come here today to your beautiful capital city and to Tākina. And she not only calls you in the physical sense, but also in the spiritual sense. You not only bring yourself, but you bring with you your family through your mannerisms, through the values you hold, spiritually. And so we acknowledge you and them, they who you bring with you here today. Haramai, haramai. We then talked about, we then did a karakia, and that karakia is the same karakia that Auntie and I just recited at the end there as a mōteatea. And it actually is the karakia that was composed for this convention centre before it was built. The name of that karakia is Tākina, which is the name of our convention building here. Tākina, in the context of this kaupapa, means to engage with each other. And it aligns with something that our city here is known for famously, internationally, nationally and locally. And it relates also to our climate and agriculture in a way as well. It talks about, you might have heard Auntie Anna go, ho, ho, hoa, fio, fio, ho, ho, hauma, taka, taka, which means the beautiful southerly winds of Wellington, ferocious and fierce, the winds that cancel all the flights at the airport, the winds that'll give you goosebumps on Lambton Quay, and blow the head out off. But there's also a line in that karakia that goes, ka tutu aniwa niwa ngā hauhoro ki waho I te haupā mai waho, and so on, which means out comes the beautiful rainbow, the clouds clear, the winds die down, the sun comes out, and you can't beat Wellington on a good day either, whānau. Now, the good thing about that karakia is that it reminds us of, the power of our environment. And so I wanted to share with you two concepts that you might have heard in your lifetime. One is kawa and the other is tikanga. And you know, I can only speak for our iwi, so if there's other iwi, they'll have other ways of explaining this. But I thought I'd share this with you as you head into your conference today. And whether you take it is up to you, but it might just spark some ideas around, you know, the community that you come from and the work that you do. So in our iwi, we're told that kawa is the things beyond human control, such as the beautiful southerly winds of Wellington, te hau o te tonga. When the winds want to blow, it is beyond human control to control that. When the rain wants to fall, the rain will fall, and there's nothing we can do about it either. Another more extreme one, just to give you a sense or an idea, is when we pass or move on and we leave this world. Death is always part of life, and it's a kawa or a thing that is beyond human control. But this is where tikanga comes into play. Tikanga is the response to the kawa, to keep us safe and to keep and to respect the things we can't control as humans. So, for example, when the rains come, how do we respond with the tikanga? We take the umbrella out and we put our umbrella up, or we put on our wet weather gear. What do we do when a loved one passes in our lives? The tikanga, or the response to that, is to hold ceremony and to grieve so that we can process our emotions. So I thought I'd leave you with that because with tikanga, some say you can't change it. We're changing tikanga all the time. And so when you go into the world of climate change, what is the tikanga that needs changing? What is the tikanga that you or we need to do that will help and protect us and keep us safe, not only now, but in the future generations to come? You know, the last thing I'll say is, ko te matua ki te ngangai, ko ngā mokopuna, ara ko te hunga mo te āpōpō. If you're wanting a why in your life, you know, something that we're very big on is look to the young people and they'll tell you what needs to be done. Nō reira, nā irunga I tērā whakaaro pai, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, kia ora tātou katoa. Oh, there's one other saying in that karakia that goes, hau mā takataka, which means go the hurricanes. Kia ora whānau, have a good one. Your MC will now come.
I ngā mana, i ngā reo, i ngā karanga maha. E aku rangatira, kua tai mai nei I tēnei rā. Tēnā koutou katoa. Tēnei ahau ka mihi, ki te mana whenua o tēnei rohe. Āti Awa no nei te reo whakamihi. Tēnei koutou katoa, tēnā koe e te rangatira e Nate. Te reo karanga e Ali, tēnā koe a tēnei koroa. Toitu ngā tūtohu whenua o tēnei takiwā. Ki te kai karakia e te rangatira, tēnā koe. My thanks to the people of this place, the mana whenua, for welcoming us here and helping us to set the focus and intention of the next 2 days. Ko Naomi Parker tōku ingoa. I am Naomi Parker, Executive Director of the New Zealand Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Research Centre, and it is my pleasure to be your MC for day one of our conference and to welcome you all on behalf of my NZAGRC team and our conference partners, AgriZero New Zealand and the Ministry for Primary Industries. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Nau mai, haere mai, welcome to you all. I extend a special welcome to the Honourable Todd McClay, who I haven't seen yet, but I'm hoping he is very close, who will be providing our opening address shortly, and also to the Honourable Mark Patterson. Before we start, some health and safety and logistics information. In the event of an earthquake, this is Wellington, please drop, cover and hold. If there is a fire or other emergency requiring us to vacate the building, follow the exit signs and please make your way to one of 2 assembly points, either outside the adjacent buildings on Cable Street or outside the adjacent buildings on Wakefield Street. If there's a requirement for first aid assistance, there is a first aid room located on levels 2 and 3 in the front of house area, and a defibrillator is available in the venue's office on the ground floor. And hopefully we won't need any of that. Please note that Tākina is a non-smoking building, and please keep your cell phones on silent. The bathrooms are outside the main doors. There are bathrooms both on the left and right. Just follow the signs. And today we will serve morning tea, lunch and afternoon tea out in the foyer. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers in a very packed agenda over the next 2 days, as well as a record number of attendees, both in person and online. So we ask that everyone returns to the sessions promptly to ensure we stay on schedule and you don't miss anything. Any questions for speakers will need to be submitted through the conference app. There will be no roving microphone. To use the app, click on the agenda and Q&A button within the app, then click the specific session and it will open the Q&A. Once in the Q&A, you can either submit your own question or vote for other questions you want answered. This will help prioritise the question order for panel chairs. If you have any issues, please see the team at the registration desk and they can give you a hand. In the conference app, you can also find photos and bios of our speakers to review at your leisure under the heading Session Information. So we will be keeping our introductions brief. With logistics out of the way, a brief opening comment from me. At our last conference in late February 2023, the impacts of cyclones Gabrielle and Hale were very front of mind. Globally, the impacts of extreme weather events and record temperatures continue to be felt. Mitigating the impacts of climate change continues to be critical, and ensuring that farmers have practical and effective tools and technologies to support that is becoming ever more urgent. Over the next 2 days, we will be hearing from a wide range of speakers on the New Zealand and international context of agriculture and climate change, and the progress being made in development and implementation of solutions. I thank all our speakers and session chairs in advance for their time and the insights they will share. I also thank them for keeping to time. Because we are incredibly flexible and adaptive, we're just going to switch around the first 2 talks. So hopefully Minister McClay will be with us soon. But we will start with a pre-record address from Dr. Jim Skea, who is the chair of the International Panel on Climate Change, to give us an introduction to the challenge of getting within 1.5 degrees.
Hello, and thank you very much for this opportunity to contribute to this important meeting. I've been a visitor to New Zealand on several occasions. I'm sorry not to be with you once again. Now, I'll share my screen. I have a PowerPoint that I'm going to show. Now, I was invited to talk on the subject of progress towards the 1.5 degree target. And just to say, I'm going to expand my remarks just a little bit to go beyond the scope of that particular remit. I think you will see the reason why as I go through. But to start, just a reminder of what IPCC is for. We were set up more than 35 years ago to assess on a comprehensive, objective, open and transparent basis the information and evidence relevant to understanding climate change, its potential impacts, and the response options for adaptation and mitigation. We aim to be neutral with respect to policy, but we don't ignore policy. We deal objectively with the consequences of exercising particular policy options. Just to say, we also do have a relationship with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. One of the things that will guide the focus of our activity is on actions that support the UN Framework Convention, and hence by implication the Paris Agreement. So what I'm going to do is structure my remarks actually around the 3 goals of the Paris Agreement. The last cycle of IPCC resulted in 10,000 pages of text, weighing about 30 kilograms altogether once it's printed out. And one of the ways in which we found it useful to digest that down into just a few minutes is to identify what IPC said about the 3 individual goals of the Paris Agreement. And just to remind you what they are, there's the so-called long-term temperature goal, the number 1 here, for limiting warming to well below 2 degrees and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees, referred to in the title of the talk. Second one is increasing the ability to adapt to climate change and foster climate resilience. And the third one is to make financial flows from developed to developing countries consistent with a pathway both towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. And the task there is to do that all in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty. Now, just to say, we very often concentrate on number 1, the long-term temperature goal, but diplomatically and politically, these goals are related to each other. Different countries attach different priorities to the different elements, and the secret of success is to recognise that these are interlocking goals, and we will not make progress on one without making progress on the other. So in the next few minutes, I'll be going through what IPCC said in the last cycle in reference to each of these goals. So starting with the long-term temperature goal, this is what we said in the last cycle about what needs to happen to global emissions of greenhouse gases if we were to limit warming to 1.5 degrees on the left-hand side, or to have a 2 in 3 chance of limiting warming to 2 degrees on the right-hand side. And each of these panels shows total greenhouse gas emissions, which includes methane and nitrous oxide, as well as carbon dioxide. It contains carbon dioxide separately and also methane or CH4. So the big message that came out of the last cycle was that to stop global warming, to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, for example, we would need to get to so-called net zero emissions of carbon dioxide by the middle of this century, around the year 2050. And net zero means that we are taking as much carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere as we would be putting in. Not the year for net zero greenhouse gas emissions in total comes earlier. There's a wide range among different assessed scenarios, but basically that does not come until the 2090s in the middle of the range for greenhouse gases in all. Needless to say, if you limit warming to below 2 degrees, the dates for net zero move out into the future, around 2070 for carbon dioxide, and for greenhouse gas emissions in all. In fact, in the middle of the range, greenhouse gas emissions in total do never reach net zero during the 21st century. I know that methane is of great interest in New Zealand. Just to flag that emissions of methane do go down in both cases. In fact, the pathway for methane emissions is quite similar in both the 1.5 and 2 degree scenarios. There are many options available at a relatively low cost, particularly for fossil fuels, and also to some extent in agriculture. Now, are we on track for all of this? Let's zoom in to the period up till 2050. And the pink slice at the top of this picture shows projected greenhouse gas emissions that are consistent with currently implemented policies. And it's showing a slight increase by 2030 and then out to the year 2050. The blue band at the bottom shows where we would need to be to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, and the green band shows where we would need to be to limit warming to 2 degrees with that 2 in 3 probability. And as you can see, we are a long way off from where we would need to be when we compare it with currently implemented policies. The purple band with a kink in it in 2030 shows where we would get to if all of the nationally determined contributions which were in place about the end of 2020 were to be followed through. that is still not enough to limit warming to even 2 degrees, but it shows that we have not lost the possibility of limiting warming to 2 degrees at that point. It's just that we would need to speed up our emissions reduction in order to limit warming roughly in line with the long-term temperature goal in the Paris Agreement. But the bottom line is what we're seeing here is 2 kinds of gaps. We're seeing an emissions gap because the nationally determined contributions are not enough to put us on Paris-compliant pathways. And we have a so-called implementation gap because the policies that have been implemented on the ground will not allow us to meet the nationally determined contributions. Now, IPCC's work in the last cycle, the cut-off date for the literature that we looked at was about the end of 2021. And of course, the world has moved on since then. And our colleagues in the United Nations Environment Programme produce every year a so-called UNEP gap report, which looks at the degree to which we're adrift from the kind of pathways we need to be on to limit warming. And they have produced new numbers just very recently. And they're clearly saying that if we continue with current policies, the world has a 2 in 3 chance of warming by at least 3.1 degrees. If we add the unconditional elements of nationally determined contributions, what the offers that every country has unconditionally made, that would come down to 2.8 degrees. And some NDCs for developing countries, some of the elements are conditional on financial support from developed countries. And if we include these conditional elements, that would bring us down further to 2.6 degrees warming during the 21st century. If we then take seriously all the net zero pledges that governments have made for 2050 or in the second half of the 21st century, then the picture becomes more optimistic. We have a 2 in 3 chance of limiting warming to 1.9 degrees and a 50% chance of limiting warming to 1.7 degrees. And that is roughly in line with the long-term temperature goal in the Paris Agreement. But just to flag, we do not have the policies on the ground at the moment to allow all these net zero pledges to be met. So if we carry on as we are with current policies, we're on the way to 3-ish degrees warming. It is just possible to limit warming in line with the Paris Agreement long-term temperature goal if all of the net zero pledges are actually honoured. So that's where we are, I think, on the long-term temperature goal. And I think you'll realise it's a very challenging picture, especially when we consider the ambitious end of the Paris long-term temperature goal, the 1.5 degrees. Now, turning to the question of adaptation and resilience, the second goal of the Paris Agreement. Here, the 6th assessment cycle was much more gloomy about the possible effects of climate change than was the previous cycle, the 5th cycle, which finished in 2014. These are the classic so-called burning ember diagrams, which show the level of risks associated with different levels of warming on the vertical axis on the left-hand side. And these are illustrated. You can see why it's called a burning embers diagram. The colours illustrate the level of risk. White is undetectable. Moderate means we have detectable risks of climate change. High is that we're beginning to see increasingly severe effects from warming. And very high means obviously very severe impacts, which will take on an irreversible character and a character that will affect people in very large numbers. And there is science behind the Pantone numbers there. They are chosen really quite carefully. But what I would like to flag is that the degree to which, for example, extreme weather events and unique and threatened systems on the left-hand side, the risk level, when we transition from moderate risks to high risks, that has now moved into the 1.5 to 2 degrees warming zone, which is where we are likely to be. So this is really a challenge, I think, for the future. We will be facing increasingly severe impacts of just the climate change that we are expecting. And of course, on our television screens, and for some of us, there's a present reality that, climate change is already having impacts. And of course, for low-lying coastal communities, small island developing states, there are existential risks from sea level rise. The risks obviously differ by system. Very relevant, in the Southern Hemisphere, the question of warm water corals. And here we are seeing the impacts already. With 1.5 degrees warming, we could see coral reefs declining by perhaps 3/4. If we get to 2 degrees warming, that decline could be almost complete. That's the left-hand side of the right-hand panel. Perhaps there are also big risks around land-based systems, for example, for wildfire damage, degradation of permafrost, biodiversity loss. We are looking at increasingly escalating risks between 1.5 and 2 degrees warming. So really, we are in the zone. We are going to see the impacts of climate change already happening. Now, one thing to flag is that the risks can in a sense, be managed. One of the big risks that comes to human health is for heat-related morbidity and mortality on the left-hand side. And you can see by putting in place adaptation measures, it is possible to reduce the level of these risks and put further into the future the point at which these risks become severe. So proactive adaptation in respect of heat-related morbidity and mortality would keep risks to the moderate level, even up to 2 degrees warming. It's also the degree to which we are exposed to risk also depends on the way that our societies develop. We have a so-called middle-of-the-road socioeconomic scenario called SSP3 here, and we have one that is more where economic development is tuned in line with sustainable development principles. On the question of food security, the impact of climate change on crop yields and food prices could be ameliorated by depending on the way that we evolve, the way that our societies evolve. So again, a strong signal, it's not all inevitable. There are things that human beings can do about this. And finally, the third goal of the Paris Agreement, the question of consistent finance flows. And we really only have data for that for mitigation activities. And what this diagram shows by sector, by type of economy, and by region, it's showing the actual yearly flows, investment flows at the current period on the left-hand side, and comparing it with the grey bars, which is the level of investment you would need by 2030 to put us in line with emission pathways consistent with the Paris Agreement. And the message overall is that we are a factor 3 to 6 below. We would need to increase these flows of investments by a factor 3 to 6 to put us on Paris consistent pathways for mitigation efforts. And the lowest gap is actually on energy supply, and the electricity system could be as low as a factor of 2 going up to 5. The gaps are much bigger for energy efficiency, for transport, and especially for agriculture, forestry, and other land use, where you would need to up the financial flows by a factor of between 10 and 30 in order to place us on Paris-compliant pathways. And I won't go through all of the regions, but also to make a strong point that the gaps in terms of investment are far higher for developing countries than they are for developed countries. So again, quite a gloomy picture on the investment side. And just let me flag that although these gaps are higher for mitigation, they are even higher for adaptation, which is almost completely reliant on public sector funding, and where the types of investment have much more a common good character and are much more tied into development patterns. I know this is a gloomy picture also. I want to have a section in here called Reasons for Hope, because there are, and we have a strong message that we as human beings do have agency over the future. There are things that we can do. And one of the reasons for hope is that we have seen big technological advances in the last decade or so, especially for renewable electricity generation and also for batteries that can fuel passenger electric vehicles. So the costs of photovoltaic energy in both onshore and offshore wind have fallen very substantially, as have the cost of batteries. Solar cells and batteries have fallen by about 80% in their overall costs, wind energy perhaps by about 50%. And the key point to emphasize here is the yellow bar along the bottom in the upper panel shows the cost of generating electricity from fossil fuels, and a clear message here that renewable energy, certainly in some parts of the world, is becoming cost competitive with fossil fuel power. And these lower costs are being reflected in market adoption. We've seen exponential growth in both renewable energy, in wind energy, solar energy, and the use of electric vehicles. And we are now at the point, in fact, where wind and solar energy together account for about 10% of global electricity generation, something just unimaginable just a few years ago. One of the other things that we did in the report was to identify the level of the potential to reduce emissions in the near term, by which we meant up to 2030, depending on the costs of the different measures. So you can see in the bottom right-hand corner the color coding for different costs in terms of US dollars per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. And I would flag that the blue parts of the bars reflect the measures that are actually where the costs are actually lower than the reference case. In other words, it would make sense to do these things even if we weren't facing the challenge of climate change. So here we have the numbers for the energy sector. Obviously, the biggest potential is wind energy and solar energy, each with about a potential of 4 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year, perhaps each about 8% of global emissions of greenhouse gases. And I would just flag a number of other options. I think probably the most interesting one is at the bottom, reducing fugitive methane emissions from oil and gas systems, where there's a big potential that is underexploited, probably simply because oil and gas companies have not been looking hard enough. And again, there's a negative cost potential for reducing methane emissions from oil and gas systems. And other potential options in the nearer term include bioelectricity, geothermal, nuclear, and to a lesser extent, carbon capture and storage, which might take more time to scale up. Again, something that's very relevant for this particular conference is what happens in the agriculture, forestry, and other land use sector. And again, big potentials. The biggest potential is reduced conversion of forests and other ecosystems, avoided deforestation, but a big potential also for carbon sequestration in agriculture, issues like soil management, reducing methane and nitrous oxide emissions from agriculture, and also the importance of ecosystem restoration, afforestation, reforestation, which has a very big potential. It's worthwhile saying that the energy and so-called AFLU sectors offer the biggest potential overall. And let's emphasize, it's not just the physical measures that we have the policy tools to make it happen. We already identified gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions reduction, emissions that have been avoided already because policies that have been put in place. Climate legislation, formal legislation, like in New Zealand, covers more than half of global emissions, and 20% of emissions are covered by some form of carbon pricing. But it's important to emphasize, and I think we did this more than in previous IPCC reports, it's not just about carbon pricing, which can work well for the power sector and industry. The tool set that has been proven to work includes regulation, standards, sunset requirements on obsolete technologies, information and advice for consumers, and also in the context of just transition to a low carbon economy, skills, training, and supply chain development. And of course, I've already mentioned the issue of investment and finance. There is enough money in the world. We need to put in place the right kind of incentives to direct money to where it needs to go. Now, what I would just like to do, just spend a couple of minutes finishing off with what IPCC is planning to do in the coming assessment cycle. It started in July last year, will probably complete around 2029, 2030. And just to say there is work already underway. The outline of a special report on climate change in cities has been agreed, and the working groups of IPCC are currently just finishing their author selection, and that report will be out in early 2027. Our task force on national greenhouse gas emission inventories, or the TFI, has the task of producing guidance for governments to report their emissions and removals to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And an outline of a new methodology report on short-lived climate forcers, that's things like sulfur dioxide, NOx, volatile organic compounds, for example. Again, the outline's been agreed, author selection has just been completed, and that will be approved in late 2027. And finally, we've just had a scoping meeting for another methodology report on carbon dioxide removal technologies and carbon capture, utilisation and storage. The meeting's been held, and the panel, the 195 governments of IPCC, are set to agree the outline early next year. And that report again will be approved in late 2027. Now, on the working group reports, the panel has decided we will produce the traditional 3 working group reports: physical science basis, impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, and mitigation of climate change. The one thing it has not agreed to do is what the timetable by which these reports will be produced. And that has caused a great deal of debate and inconclusive debate at the last plenary sessions of IPCC. And we will need to reach a decision on that in February next year, following the output of the scientific scoping meeting for the reports, which is due to take place in Kuala Lumpur just next week. And in fact, taking account of the fact the date at which this talk is actually going to go out. So that's where we are at the moment. And just one last slide. Alongside the Working Group 2 report on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, Working Group 2 is going to produce a distinct report revising and updating IPCC technical guidelines on impacts and adaptation, including adaptation indicators, metrics and methodologies. And that should help measure progress towards the global goal on adaptation reached through the UAE consensus at COP28. And just to say, this also may help to establish some incentives to try to get more private finance into adaptation activities. And very finally, the synthesis report for the 7th assessment cycle is going to be produced by late 2029, after the completion of the working group reports. So that was my very rapid summary of the key conclusions of the 6th assessment cycle with respect to the 3 goals of the Paris Agreement. And I hope it's given you a fairly clear indication of where IPCC intends to go in the coming cycle. And I do thank you for your attention, and I will at this point thank you and bring my opening remarks to a close. Thank you.
And thank you to Jim for preparing that for us, and fantastic to have that high-level overview of the challenge at the outset of our 2 days. It is now my very great pleasure to introduce the Honourable Todd McClay, and thank you, Minister, for your flexibility. Minister of Agriculture and Minister for Trade, as well as Minister of Forestry, Minister for Hunting and Fishing, and Associate Minister of Foreign Affairs. Welcome you to the stage to provide our formal opening address. Thank you, Minister.
Well, Naomi, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, kia ora, and privileged to be here. I'm glad there was a little bit of traffic. I very much enjoyed and found fascinating, extremely informative, the presentation we've just received. And so that worked out for me, but my apologies for keeping you waiting a little bit. Can I firstly recognise a number of people in the room who will be speaking today? Of course, we've just heard from Jim Skea, Stuart Horne, New Zealand's Climate Change Ambassador, Rob Carr, the Climate Change Commissioner, but it's a very distinguished group of presenters and speakers you have over the next 2 days. And I do know that some of my ministerial colleagues will be here, the Honourable Judith Collins, who's doing a very important amount of work around science, innovation and technology. Ministers Hoggard and Patterson, who are Associate Minister of Agriculture, will be here. And of course, Andrew Hoggard is actually today down in the South Island as a result of the announcement of avian flu outbreak in a chicken farm there. Our economy depends on New Zealand's food and fibre sector. It's our biggest export earner, generating just over $53 billion this year. And a key part of our vision is to double the value of exports over 10 years. With 80% of all of the goods exports coming from the primary sector and around 360,000 Kiwis employed because of rural activity, farming, forestry and horticulture remain a mainstay of the New Zealand's economic activity. But we must meet our international obligations. We have to find ways to work to do so without it being at the expense of jobs or food production. Now, over the next 2 days, a number of experts will speak to you about, among other things, the actions the government's taking to meet our climate change obligations and why it's so important for New Zealand to be proactive here. I'd like to spend just a few minutes setting the scene before those more detailed discussions. Around a third of global greenhouse gas emissions are associated with food production systems. However, agriculture makes up around half of New Zealand's emissions, which is unique for a developed country. The next closest is Ireland, where agriculture provides a little less than 40% of their emissions profile. This means that New Zealand has had a strong early focus on agricultural climate action, with a real focus on investing in research and development to address climate change. The government also recognises the importance of providing certainty and clarity to the sector. In particular, we know there is a lot of interest in what the 2050 methane target should be, as it's currently a very wide range set in legislation. It's crucial we get this right to provide investment and decision certainty. In June of this year, myself and the Climate Change Minister Simon Watts appointed a panel of highly regarded New Zealand-based and international scientists to review the methane science and targets, and we have now just recently received that work done by the panel and will have more to say on that shortly. Clarifying the target is a priority, as this will set us well to really move forward on how we collectively can best achieve it. After all, it's important that for the agricultural sector that they have the certainty of knowing what it is they need to achieve so that they can work together on how they can achieve this. Given the importance of this sector to the New Zealand economy, it's also vital we're not shutting down Kiwi farms. Last week we delivered on our election commitment to take agriculture out of the emissions trading scheme, and this paves the way for a more pragmatic approach to managing agricultural emissions. And the reason for this is a tax alone won't achieve what we need to. Innovation, technology and hard work will. Without this change, the agricultural processors would have been required to start paying for their on-farm emissions from 1 January 2025, and farmers would have had to start paying for on-farm emissions from 1 January 27. But we also need to know what it is that's being emitted and where. And so we're supporting farmers on the ground to estimate and measure their emissions. The Ministry of Primary Industries has worked with the agricultural sector to develop a standard way for estimating agricultural emissions at a farm level, and this is key to supporting the government's commitment to measurement by 2025. Developing a standard approach to estimating emissions that's consistent will provide transparency and fairness across all farming and growing systems. It'll also reduce risk of confusion about getting multiple numbers from different tools. And delivering this first version of the methodology is part of the government's Q4 action plan, and we will be delivering on that. We're also ensuring our farmers and growers have access to the best tools and innovation by increasing funding to AgZero to develop emissions reductions technology. More than $400 million is being invested over the next 4 years to accelerate the availability of tools and technology to reduce on-farm emissions and meet markets. These investments will maintain and enhance our competitive export advantage and will reduce our emissions. This year, we also had a new partner come on board with AgZero, the BNZ. And the government and BNZ are together committing an additional $8 million to boost New Zealand's efforts to reduce agricultural emissions. This joint government-industry partnership now has $191 million committed for the first 4 years, with lots of projects, very hopeful, positive projects in the pipeline. These investments will support the development of progress of identifying and breeding low-emissions animals, developing methane and nitrous oxide inhibitors, and supporting global collaboration and research with partners to find solutions that will benefit the New Zealand farming systems. We've also committed just over $52 million to early research and development investment through the Climate Change Action on Agricultural Emissions, which consists of genetic research, methonogen vaccine research, early life intervention studies, development of better on-farm emissions measurement tools, and effluent and feed management systems. These investments will sharpen our competitive edge and increase export value, not only on the primary sector, food and fibre that we sell, but also in the new technologies that will become available to others around the world. Looking internationally, the government is focused on supporting the international cooperation framework to be effective and efficient in addressing climate change, while at the same time ensuring New Zealand can navigate and succeed in a global economic transition taking place. The food and fibre sector is crucial to these objectives, and New Zealand's work to make sure its importance is recognised globally. The annual UN Climate Change Conference is the global forum to achieve this. COP29 concluded in Baku on the 24th of November, which saw countries reach crucial agreement on climate finance and carbon markets that will address global greenhouse gas emissions. And New Zealand is pleased to see COP29 reach agreement for an ambitious but a collectively achievable goal for climate finance by 2035, and improving access to climate finance, particularly for our Pacific neighbours and other developing countries. International carbon markets under the Paris Agreement are now fully operational after the successful conclusion of negotiations chaired by the New Zealand Climate Change Minister Simon Watts and Singapore's Minister for Sustainability and the Environment, Grace Fu. This outcome provides the necessary confidence to unlock investments in activities that reduce emissions and enable countries to be able to work together to meet their climate targets. The government's also engaged across agricultural forums at COP29 to make sure that agriculture is addressed appropriately at future COPs and on the global climate agenda. New Zealand participated in agriculture negotiations and shared our expertise within collaborative initiatives such as the US and UAE co-led agricultural initiative Mission for Climate, which brings governments and industry together on innovative spirits to develop mitigation solutions for food and fibre sector. Another element of this is supporting the international research collaboration, building off our domestic efforts. We do this principally through the Global Research Alliance on Agricultural Greenhouse Gases, which brings together 68 member countries and more than 30 partner organisations to tackle the dual objectives of growing more food without growing emissions. The Global Research Alliance has provided opportunities to collaborate through bilateral and multi-country projects. For example, one of its first projects was the Global Rumen Census, which involved 140 scientists from 73 organisations and 35 countries. This work underpins most of today's research on vaccines and inhibitors. Also, through the Global Research Alliance, this month we announced the successful outcomes for our partnership with Ireland and Germany. And we're now on our third year of a joint research initiative with Ireland, and recently announced 3 new projects focusing on nitrous oxide emissions interventories, nitrification inhibitors, and standardised methods for estimating on-farm methane emissions. And our new partnership with Germany will enable both countries to respond collaboratively to the urgent need to find solutions that address the global impact of agriculture on climate while considering food security needs. Another crucial component for farmers using climate solutions is ensuring market acceptance of products that use and the products used producing them. We're working with other countries and international food regulators to make certain international standards respond to mitigation options efficiently. For example, New Zealand has been successful in having 189 member countries of the Codex Alimentarius, the global food safety standard setting body, agree to prioritise a food safety risk assessment of the methane inhibitor bromoform, the first environmental inhibitor to be considered by Codex to facilitate trade. Yet another element is ensuring that other countries recognise the sustainability performance of our sector. We work with the sector to guarantee international agreement standards are appropriate for our farming systems, pushing back against methodologies that favour other systems against unilateral sustainability claims. Finally, on the international front, the government's also focused on supporting sustainability and prosperity in the Pacific. We provide climate finance and work with our Pacific neighbours to improve food security, to build climate resilience, and to build sustainable food systems. In parting, I want to assure you that the government is committed to working with the agricultural sector, not against it, in reducing our agricultural emissions. We're up for the challenge of reducing emissions without undermining profitability and risking leakage, so food is produced in countries that are less carbon efficient. The sector is key to our export double aspirations, and this is also why we must keep up with market demands and gains being made by others. The final thing I wanted to talk about just for a moment is the very important role of forestry within this system. Forestry has a very important role to play in New Zealand in helping us find cost-effective ways of sequestering carbon. And we want to get the rules right so that battle between forest and farm and forest doesn't take up unnecessary time when it comes to setting good and smart policy. Just within agriculture, we need sensible rules that work towards an achievement and just add costs. We need to do the same thing in the forestry sector. And so we're very pleased to be working closely with those in the forestry industry to make sure that forestry has a very important future in New Zealand, that it can be cost effective, that they too can meet their obligations, both in what we need to achieve around climate change, but also to the environment, and that the rules are set in place that we can plant trees and they can be given certainty. I guess if there was a final way that I wanted to finish was to say that I am being more cautious probably in my discussion with you today than we might other be, because I'm mindful that there is a carbon auction later in the week. And the reason I mention that is one of the most important things we can do, from forestry to farming to all other parts of the economy when it comes to climate change, is to have very sensible rules and to be calm about what we need to achieve and the way we need to achieve it. Certainty and dependability will help all parts of New Zealand that need to adjust to do so and to meet the obligations that we've all committed to. And so we have been very cautious in this area over the last year, not to make announcements for the sake of them, but to be considered and to work with all partners to start building the idea that certainty doesn't come from an announcement alone. It comes from working together, it comes from sensible rules, it comes from setting targets and standards, and then finding solutions that will achieve these. Ladies and gentlemen, farmers are not New Zealand's problem when it comes to climate change, but they are certainly a very important part of the solution. We've often said over the last year that the war against farmers has ended, but the battle to meet our international obligations while producing high quality, safe food that has a good environmental and climate playing story continues. And with the 2030 target and 2050 target, that challenge and that obligation will remain. We're committed to working with you and others in the sector to ensure that it's done. Thank you. Now, I think my staff committed me to answering questions. Oh yeah, that was nice of them. Let's have a few.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you for that fantastic introduction and comprehensive overview of what's being done in New Zealand. We do just have one question so far in the app, but we may get some more through for you. So the first question is, thank you for pointing to recent funding for ag greenhouse gas mitigation. As Jim Skea pointed out, they're short of the outcomes needed. When and how will we see funding matched to outcomes?
Well, it's a very important thing because a lot of what I suppose has happened in the early days is about process and what we want to achieve. Outcome is yet to be delivered, but much of the world faced that. We've got to be really mindful that our farmers and across the primary sector are some of the most carbon efficient food producers in the world. But that's not a reason for us to say we think we're better than the rest of you, therefore we're not going to do anything until you do. It is a reason for us to keep innovating and investing. And the solution, for countries around the world to agricultural emissions is one of two things. For those where agricultural emissions are a smaller part of, their overall profile, they get to make the gains that they want to or they need to in urban areas and through transportation. New Zealand doesn't have that ability. And the point of that I'm making is they get their gains without having to close down food production or put significant cost upon it. We don't have that luxury, if I might call it that. And the way forward for New Zealand will be innovation, because actually in the farming systems in New Zealand, it has always been around innovation. And farmers, when given the space or the opportunity, or there has been this necessity that also is set by regulation, have achieved that. We want to work very collaboratively, and that's the reason that we have the $400 million that has invested, the joint financing to look for these solutions and invest in them with NZAGRC and others. In a recent meeting I had with the board of NZAGRC, I was very clear to them, the government is putting money into this not so we can say, aren't we good because we're investing, because we want you to find those solutions and we want them to be commercialised and we want them to be available to New Zealand farmers and farmers elsewhere in the world in the next very short period of time. And so I think over the next 2 or 3 years, from the investment that has been made by the previous and current government, you'll start to hear about some of the opportunities that investment is showing, and as they move through our system, they become commercialised, and of course then we're working very hard to make sure that they are recognised as being safe when it comes to the food that we sell elsewhere.
Thank you, Minister. I think there are no more questions, but I think that answer is a perfect way to kick off our conference. It's a great stage setter for us. So thank you very much, and please join with me in thanking the Minister once more.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Stuart Horne, the Climate Change Ambassador for New Zealand. So I ask Stuart to join me up here. Stuart has been in the role since October this year and has recently returned from COP. So very much looking forward to your insights, and over to you. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou, ko Stuart Horne talking. Thank you very much, Naomi, for the introduction. As you heard, I've been in this job since the 1st of October, so be gentle on me, and I've just come back from COP. So I took on this role having spent the last 3 years running NZACC's economic division. So that's had a focus: economic analysis, business engagement, green economy, and working very closely with New Zealand's agriculture sector, particularly in terms of managing non-tariff barriers. The government was quite clear that climate change was an economic issue, and this is the lens through which much of my engagement so far in the role has been. As Naomi mentioned, I got back from Baku just over a week ago, and I thought it was probably useful, at the end of COP29, to give my reflections on sort of what it looked like, and particularly where New Zealand has a role to play internationally in the agriculture and climate space. Then I might turn to some general observations in terms of other sort of opportunities or how New Zealand is perceived. One of my roles as climate ambassador is to turn up at SAGRC's press conferences, speak, particularly if the minister is busy, and as you know, he was very focused on negotiating the carbon markets, facilitating that carbon markets outcome. I did, I think, 9 or 10 presentations. It started to blur, to be honest, after a while, but 5 of them had a trade and agriculture lens, because that's where people are interested in hearing from New Zealand, because we have perspectives and insights to share. I think there's a number of takeaways, I suppose, that come through, and I'll run through them quickly, and then perhaps I'll break them down a little bit. I think one of the ones that the minister's already talked about is the fact that our unique emissions profile means that we've been tackling an issue that's been under the radar for many years, but that is changing quickly. And as that focus grows, it makes New Zealand's actions very relevant. And you see that relevance in terms of interest in international partners, partnerships, which the minister has touched on, and I'll touch a little bit more on. An interest in our innovative approach to tackling trade and sustainability. And then just very much a perception in terms of New Zealand, despite often, what we see in the paper, that is still seen globally as a leader in sustainable trade. And when I say trade, obviously I talk about that because the vast majority of our goods trade is agriculture. So in terms of, Baku and those perspectives, the minister's already talked about the fact that agriculture takes up over half our emissions. And our emissions profile, with the exception of Ireland, just doesn't look like other developed countries. Also, we've got one of the highest percentages of renewable energy in the world, and so some sectors were actually further down our pathway to net zero. But it also means we've had to look more intensively at agricultural emissions earlier than in other countries. But equally under the Paris Agreement, and so since 2015, we're seeing a lot more interest in agriculture than we did under the UNFCCC and Kyoto Protocol over that 1992 to 2020 period. So 3 reasons, and one obviously is that as you make progress in other sectors, agriculture becomes a larger focus. People, developing countries, who many, like New Zealand, have a large proportion of agriculture emissions, now have emissions reductions targets. And all countries are supposed to take economy-wide, all sectors, all gases targets. That's the whole 195 countries that were at COP in Baku. As countries look at emission reduction pathways needed to limit warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees, there's a growing attention in looking at non-CO2 greenhouse gases. And as that focus grows, I think I'm anticipating a growing realisation of the need to align policies and economic signals with actual action on agriculture. So I spoke at a World Bank function that highlighted the point that the minister referred to earlier, that agri-food generates about 1/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions. 3/4 of these come from developing countries. And agri-food, as you saw from Jim's presentation, lags behind other sectors in financing for climate action costs. So, I don't need to tell you how critical agriculture is for New Zealand's economy, but equally it's that critical element in supporting global food security and the fact that we can actually produce, as the minister said, agriculture, our food, more carbon efficiently than many, many countries out there. The OECD at the moment estimates that global spending on trade and production distorting agricultural support, a bit like what we did in the 70s, is over $850 billion annually. If you put that in perspective, that's about 4 times the amount spent on global official development assistance. At the presentation I was at, the World Bank analysis showed that repurposing a portion of government spending to implement more emission-efficient technologies for crops and livestock, if you did it effectively, could reduce global emissions from agriculture by more than 40%. So one of those messages out there in New Zealand is, you know, subsidies can be environmentally harmful. Many subsidies are. And, you know, the examples we have in New Zealand of farming without subsidies and how that has been effective and efficient. So again, as the focus grows, more interest in New Zealand. Again, why? We operate largely without subsidies. Our farms are some of the most carbon efficient in the world. And C, the solutions that New Zealand are working on, Agri-Zero, the GRA, and I'm sure we'll hear from Wayne later on today, they're aimed at pasture-based farming rather than feedlot-based. So they're often more applicable to developing countries. So, but equally, and I've touched on this and the Minister touched on this, when you talk to developed country partners, they acknowledge that as they're reducing their emissions, as they're bringing things down, there's only, you know, you close down your coal-fired power stations, the agriculture emissions and methane in particular becomes an increasingly focus as an element that has been one of the hardest to reduce. So again, lots of interest in learning from New Zealand's experience, including the fact that we're introducing a system for emissions pricing on farms by 2030. And really, you know, there's only 1 or 2 other countries on the planet that are talking about doing that at the moment. As the Minister mentioned, there was real interest in New Zealand sharing our expertise at COP. So one of the other events I spoke on is the US-UAE-led Climate Innovation Mission for Agriculture Innovation Mission for Climate. They had a whole bunch of recommendations of what you needed to do, and it was actually great to look at them because when you ran through their recommendations, and I'll just pick 2 or 3, they didn't look that far off to what we're doing. One of them was enhancing the inclusion of climate-smart agriculture and food systems and nationally determined contributions, design and implementation, which really is inherent in New Zealand's focus on nature-based solutions and climate innovation in terms of the current climate change strategy. Then there was a talk about focus on building global partnerships to overcome challenges and scale agricultural innovation. And again, the Global Research Alliance, which New Zealand was a driving force behind, is a key element of that. And then scaling public-private partnerships, and Agri-Zero is obviously a classic example of that, with the government putting in money and the private sector. New Zealand's also a board member of the Food and Agriculture for Sustainable Transformation, which is called FAST partnership. That was launched last year at Dubai in COP28, and its goal is to advocate and coordinate action between the COPs on agri-food systems. Basically, it's trying to fill a gap as the de facto agriculture and climate coordination initiative, and that's kind of lacked a little bit of visibility and coordination within the COP framework. So that aligns very nicely with New Zealand's objective of increasing global finance into climate solutions for the agriculture sector. Obviously, the Minister's talked about our work and support for the GRA. We've talked about our engagement in the Pacific, which is a real focus of the $1.3 billion that New Zealand has committed over 4 years for climate finance. One of those elements, though, is a $25 million climate smart agriculture initiative that leverages our expertise to support development of greenhouse gas inventories and mitigation practices in a whole range of developing countries in Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. The other element that we're seeing, as I say, is that interest in international partnerships. So during COP, the Minister for Climate Change, the Honourable Simon Watts, he had an intensive series of bilateral engagements. I think he went with 9 or 10 countries, which, bearing in mind he was also facilitating the Article 6 carbon markets, shows you he was a busy man. Across the conversations, but particularly engagement with Southeast Asian nations, Malaysia, Vietnam, Philippines, real interest in climate cooperation with New Zealand, and often that was underpinned by an interest in having conversations on climate smart agriculture. Also, I've amongst on our ETS as well, which had a lot of interest, including from developed countries. A lot of the work, the cooperation obviously is complementary to existing engagement that MP and I, others are working through the Global Research Alliance, but it is also that reflection of how New Zealand is seen in terms of our expertise in the agricultural climate space, particularly in that measuring, reporting and verification of greenhouse gas emissions. But it isn't just limited, that engagement, to developing countries. And again, you've heard about the partnership between New Zealand and Germany, the Alliance for the Climate, Dialogue on Climate and Agriculture. That's got 3 pillars: policy development, research collaboration, and third country engagement. And equally, the Climate Change Partnership with Ireland, again, which is about research and agricultural research and taking advantage that the Irish and ourselves have similar pasture-based systems, and if we pull together our scientific capability, we'll make further progress to finding solutions. I'll switch now to the trade space because, again, you know, that's another area where I think New Zealand is seen as has been taking a lead internationally, which I've been asked to talk about. And so how are we using trade agreements as an avenue to support sustainable agriculture and ensure that trade and sustainable agriculture goals reinforce each other? And that's critical because, you know, you need successful trade to feed the world, but you also need that trade to be sustainable. Otherwise, you've got a fundamental problem coming down the line. So examples, the New Zealand EU FTA, it's got a chapter on sustainable food systems. That's the first for either us or the EU. The New Zealand UK FTA also has an article on sustainable agriculture. And I'll be honest with you, these elements are important commercially. One of the strong drivers for both the EU and the UK was that we had a sustainable farming system that they felt was comparable to their own. They were very focused on similar environmental credentials, and that was a key element in the European Parliament's approval of the EU deal. Equally, anybody who's exported to a supermarket or in the EU or the UK is clearly aware that retailers' sustainability requirements are usually even more stringent. You know, many of you have heard that phrase, you know, regulators bark but retailers bite, because that's actually when an exporter really needs to make those hard rules. And I know my colleague from MPI, Diana Rex, going to talk a little bit more about this later on. But overall, up over this, trade can, but it must facilitate and support sustainable agriculture, including those efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for agriculture production. And obviously, as I've said to you, tackling environmentally harmful agricultural subsidies is vital to that effort. But at the same time, I think what we're also focusing on in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade is ensuring that sustainability is not used as a disguised barrier to trade. Trade and climate action can support each other. Recently, New Zealand signed the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability. That's an example of groundbreaking agreement that supports both climate action and international trade. And I thought the last point I'd talk about is, you know, I can stand here and go, yep, New Zealand's a global leader in sustainable trade, and you go, yep, that's what they pay him to say. And that's probably fair. But it's not just us saying it. For those of it, you missed it, New Zealand achieved the first place in the 3rd consecutive year of the 2024 Sustainable Trade Index. So the Sustainable Trade Index, it's produced by the Heinrich Foundation and the International Institute for Management Development. So it ranks New Zealand first out of 30 economies they looked at, which include APEC members and signatories to the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP. So basically that looks at 30 major economies' ability to trade in an economically, socially and environmentally sustainable way. New Zealand performed strongly across all 3 of the index core pillars and ranked first in the environmental and societal data sets. So we were quite pleased to see that award because it reflects the country's long-standing commitment to sustainable and inclusive trade and that pursuit of innovative trade policy practices that deliver commercial benefits. So I suppose my takeaway is when you're engaging internationally in the climate space, I think it's fair to say that along with our engagement and support in the Pacific, that experience we have in the agricultural space, that efforts we're taking to manage methane, all the other steps that New Zealand has made to make its farming less and less carbon intensive are areas of critical interest to our partners. That is why we get cut through. That gives us that credibility of being there. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stuart. You can sit closer if you like. Yeah. So we've got one question on the app, so please keep your questions coming. What might the EU do if we don't meet our NDCs and agricultural emissions reduction targets?
Well, I mean, this has obviously been a subject. We have ongoing conversations with the EU in terms of where they're going and where we're going. So it's a two-way street, because obviously there's 27 economies in the European Union, and obviously they've also got their targets to meet. I think when we have had these discussions, everybody's clear that both New Zealand and the EU remain very committed to our net zero target of 2050. Everybody's working hard towards their NDC targets. So I'm not getting into a speculation of what they do. What I can say is we have ongoing and positive conversations with the European Union in this space, and certainly I think we'll continue to do that as part of our FTA and our wider engagement. And certainly our Minister for Climate Change had a very positive conversation with his counterpart when we were in Baku.
Thanks, Stuart. The next question is, how interlinked was the concept of being nature positive at COP? Is there a perception that the carbon zero focus is too narrow?
That's a really good question, because I think in many ways that nature positive can mean very different things to different people. So it is increasingly an element of countries' engagement in terms of being nature positive. Whether that focus, you know, as I say, it really depends on how countries are interpreting that element. I think it would be my take on how that's perceived, and certainly that was my impression in Baku.
And what effect will the advent of carbon tax on farmers in Denmark have for New Zealand exports?
Well, the Danes are bringing in place a carbon tax in Denmark in 2030. So at this stage, that's at the same time that we're putting in place emissions pricing in New Zealand. Again, we're 6 years out. I suppose my point at the moment, that puts us genuinely in the world-leading space along with our Danish friends. Again, getting back to that point, Denmark's one of 27 countries in the European Union. So you're engaging with a whole range of countries. I think the general view is, no matter what our exports, we are at the forefront. I mean, frankly, you know, when we talk to other European countries, they're not as far down this route as we are. So I think we can be pretty comfortable at this stage that New Zealand is still, you know, 84% of New Zealand farmers can already, you know, already cross their farm gate emissions. You know, we are well down this pathway, and certainly engagements both with EU member countries and with Britain, they were very impressed by how far down New Zealand had taken our climate conversations with our agriculture sector in terms of things like emissions pricing.
Thanks, Stuart. With removal of agriculture from the ETS, are we at risk of not meeting requirements in our EU and UK FTAs?
Well, again, without sounding like a broken record on that, you know, it'd be a little rough for the EU and the UK to say, I can't believe you've removed agriculture from the ETS when none of them have agriculture in the ETS. So let's, you know, that's what the reality is at the moment. You know, there's us, again, I'm sounding repeating myself, but it's us in Denmark that are moving down that pathway and others aren't there. So the overarching point is, are we taking our steps, you know, towards our NDCs? Are we taking steps towards net zero by 2050? And are we demonstrating that we're not just resting on laurels and doing nothing? And I do think it's fair to say, with initiatives like Agri-Zero, there are some really good stories coming out of New Zealand that you know, farming communities globally are still, you know, I'm not saying they're catching up, because there's some really interesting work happening out there, but you know, I think we are doing some useful and interesting work that's certainly being appreciated and talked about. That's why the Germans want to partner with us. That's why the Irish want to partner with us. They're not just doing it because they like New Zealand, because they see there's genuine value in doing it. They see that our scientists are doing some really important work, and that's going to have value for their systems as well.
Fantastic. And I think we can finish that up there. Thank you so much again, Stuart, and thanks for answering all of those questions.
No worries. Thank you very much.